Hello and welcome to the the fifth webinar of our series for International Education Week, our AFS Global Competence webinars. This one we are so lucky to have entitled Assessing Intercultural Competence with Dr. Darla Deerdorf. My name is Sarah Collins and I work at AFS Intercultural Programs, and we're just delighted to have you. So I'd like to, before we begin, show you a little bit of housekeeping. We will be using, as you know, the Zoom platform, and there you'll see in your screen a black box where you can ask some questions when we pause and have time for that. So you can also adjust your audio settings, so we do hope you can hear us okay. The chat is disabled, so you won't be able to chat with us, but you could ask us either logistical questions or content questions in the Q&A box. So please do so when we invite you to do that. A little bit about AFS. AFS is an international educational organization, and we are in 60 countries around the world. We provide intercultural learning opportunities to help develop global citizens. And we do this through multiple programs, such as our exchange programs, our host family programs, our volunteer programs, our intercultural learning and training programs. And we have program activity in 94 countries. We exchange around 12,000 participants, and we work with around 8,500 host families. So you can kind of see a little overview here of what AFS is all about. Many of you are either AFS staff or volunteers, or were an AFS participant yourself, so we're happy to have you here. And if you're new to AFS, we're also happy to have you. So our panelist today is Dr. Darla Deerdorf. We are so excited to have her. She is the Executive Director of the Association of International Education Administrators at Duke University in the United States. She is an adjunct or visiting professor at numerous universities around the world. Dr. Deerdorf has served on faculty of Harvard University's Future of Learning Institute and is faculty at the Summer Institute for Intercultural Communication. Dr. Deerdorf has published and presented widely on topics in international education, global leadership, and intercultural learning assessment. So we are so lucky to have her today to walk us through this very, very, very important topic. So with that said, I will hand it over to Dr. Darla Deerdorf. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks to all of you who are joining us from around the world. We're really glad that you could make time for this, and really appreciate your interest in what I consider to be a very important topic in terms of how do we assess intercultural competence. And I've spent the last decade of my life working on this and have been especially appreciative of being able to work with AFS. I'm a member of one of the advisory boards through AFS, and in fact just recently returned from an AFS related conference in Italy where we were talking about intercultural learning as well. So I enjoyed meeting some of the AFS colleagues there, and I have really enjoyed working with AFS through the years on topics around intercultural learning. So today, I think the next slide has an overview for you. We'll be briefly talking about some of the common myths that are often believed about assessing intercultural competence, and then we'll talk about the why, what, and how of this assessment, and then end with some lessons learned, and then I actually will conclude with what we're seeing as a paradigm shift around assessing intercultural competence and intercultural learning. Before we continue, I just want to say that I really appreciate all of you listening in English, especially if English is not your first language. And hopefully you'll be able to make sense of all of this. And I'm not going to be speaking too fast, I hope, for you. But thank you again very much for being part of it. And we're looking forward to hearing your questions and your experiences as well. But before we go any further, we actually have a quick poll for you just to find out where where you're joining us from. And so on your screen, you should see a question about where are you joining this webinar from. And then you'll see broad areas of the world: North America, Central America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, New Zealand, Australia. So if you could take just a moment to let us know where you're joining from, we would really appreciate that, to get a sense of who's out there and who's participating. So over half of you are joining us from North America, but we do have some also joining, about 30% from Europe. And then we have smaller percentages in South and Central America, and then even smaller percentages joining from Asia and Africa, and very small from New Zealand, Australia, in part maybe because of the time difference. So we appreciate you all joining us on today. We do have one more question about what kind of experience you have with assessing intercultural competence. We'd like to just have some idea about whether you have no experience, a little, some, or a lot. Okay, so it looks like almost half of you have a little experience in this area, about 40%, 42%. Then we have a fair amount with some experience. So 32% of you are somewhat experienced. So some of this might be a review for you, since you already have some experience. So this webinar is more at kind of the basic level, I would say. And then we have about 23% with no experience. And then there are a few of you, 4%, who really have a lot of experience. So this will definitely be a review or refresher for you for sure. But maybe you'll gain some new insights as we go through this. All right. So let's look at some myths. And I'm sure you could add some of your own myths to this in terms of what you've heard, but these are, I would say, misconceptions or myths about what persons think about assessing intercultural competence. And this is what we need to try to hopefully move beyond. So I'm going to share with you just a few. Myth number one, that there's one best assessment tool. And I often get this question, people asking, Darla, what's the one best tool to use to assess intercultural competence? There is no one best tool. And in fact, there are over 140 different assessment tools for intercultural competence, various parts of intercultural competence. Most of those are self-report, but there's no one best tool at all. Myth number two, a pre and post measure is sufficient, and particularly for exchange programs and study abroad programs. I know that this is a common myth. It is, while it's logical, it makes sense to want to find out how much someone has learned through an exchange experience or a study abroad experience, that just using one pre-post measure is actually insufficient based on research. Not to say it's not possible, certainly you can use it, but it needs to be more than that. That's really insufficient in terms of understanding the whole picture of intercultural competence development. So it can be part of what we do, but it shouldn't just be one pre-post measure. So that's something we'll talk a bit more about. Myth number three, that there's a one-size-fits-all for measuring intercultural competence. I've heard conversations where persons will say, well, if we're all measuring intercultural competence, why don't we just all use the same tool? But the reality is, and we'll talk more about this, is that intercultural competence is very complex, and there's no one tool that can assess the whole of the complexity of intercultural competence. And furthermore, different exchange programs, different study abroad programs, even at a university level, let's say different curricula, focus on different aspects of intercultural competence. Each program or curriculum might have its own priorities in terms of which elements of intercultural competence they desire to focus on. And so given all the variances within programs and parameters, there's actually no one-size-fits-all for what we're trying to assess. Myth number four is that assessment is about numbers. That sometimes the persons might say, well, we send this many students abroad or bring this many students here or so on, and talk about the numbers. And I really appreciate that AFS emphasizes intercultural learning and the importance of that intercultural aspect. That there's so much more beyond numbers, beyond those who participate, to what they actually learn and what they're able to achieve through that kind of experience. Myth number 5, that assessment is the same as program evaluation. And it's not. It's actually 2 different processes entirely for 2 different purposes. When we look at definitions around assessment is, in the end, really comes back to student learning and changes in students' learning or participants' learning. Whereas program evaluation is about improving the program. And what I've seen oftentimes, particularly at the higher education level, is that assessment and program evaluation get equated with each other, when that's really a misnomer. And so that's important to address, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So when we, moving on, when we look at the assessment part, a natural place to start is with how. And this is a very normal place to start. It's how do we assess, or what tools do we use? But I want to encourage you to consider that those are actually not the starting points. The starting point is why. Why do you want to assess intercultural competence? What is the purpose for the assessment? And as part of that, how will the assessment be used? This is really important to start with the why. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Simon Sinek's TED Talk on the Golden Circle. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to watch it. But there he really goes into why it's so important to start with why. And so I want you to think about, first of all, answering the question, why? Why do you want to assess intercultural competence? And hopefully your response will be something along the lines of, well, to improve the participants' intercultural competence. And then the second part of the question I ask them is, how do you use the results? So the question is then, if you are already assessing, how do you provide that feedback to the students so that they can continue to grow and develop in their intercultural competence? It's really important to give that feedback back to the participants. So the starting point is why, being very clear on why you want to assess. The second question that we need to talk about before we get to the how, we need to talk about what exactly do you want to assess around intercultural competence. To go to the what, and looking at what is intercultural competence and what is specifically are your goals and your objectives around intercultural competence. So I'm assuming, since most of you are participating, that you might have as a what that you do hope to assess intercultural competence. As I mentioned already, intercultural competence is quite complex. There's a lot to it. So the question that you would need to then ask is, how are you defining it? What is intercultural competence in your context? What is your definition, and what are you basing that definition on? And to that end, I would like to share with you one research-based definition of intercultural competence. Some of you may be familiar with this. And I realize this is a bit small to read, and in just a moment, I'll provide you with a link where you can find this online as well. But what you're seeing on the screen right now is the first research-based definition and framework of intercultural competence. And this came out of the research I've done. And what I was finding is that there had been over 50 years worth of scholarly work done on this concept of intercultural competence, but very little of that had been research-based. And so I was interested in seeing if the experts and the scholars who had been writing about this, if they could reach consensus on what exactly do they mean by intercultural competence. And so what you see here is the consensus definition of what they were able to arrive at. Both of these models have the same elements that they agreed on. The one on the left, the pyramid model, was the first one that was developed from the research that shows the importance of attitudes as the foundation, as the starting point for the development of intercultural competence, and that the key starting attitudes within intercultural competence development, as you can see here, are openness, respect, and curiosity. Those are really important to have in place in order to build further in terms of intercultural competence. And I've actually worked with students who unfortunately did not exhibit those attitudes were quite closed-minded, and it makes it much more difficult then to continue in terms of the development of intercultural competence. The knowledge and skills you see listed there in the boxes, and would just highlight the cultural self-awareness piece. So beyond the attitudes, that knowledge and skills certainly are important parts of this competence definition. And observe and interpret, and in particular, I would mention with listening, it's listening for understanding, not listening for reply or listening for judgment. So that's a really key distinction to make. But that language did not actually come into this conversation. And with any model or framework, it's important to ask what's missing. And certainly language is not overtly mentioned. And when I followed up then with the scholars and experts in the study, they said that, well, yes, language is necessary, but not sufficient for intercultural competence, that they knew too many cases of fluent fools, of those who knew the grammar and vocabulary of another language, but were interculturally incompetent in navigating within that culture. And that is the reason for not being able to reach consensus on the role of language in intercultural competence. The knowledge, skills, and attitudes then, based on this research, lead to an internal outcome of what happens within an individual, that they become more adaptable, more flexible, that they develop empathy, and so on. And then what we see and experience in others is this external outcome of the behavior and communication that is both appropriate and effective in interactions across difference. And so if you need to have a summary definition of intercultural competence, it's really there in that external outcome piece. But it's important to understand that there's so many other elements of intercultural competence, as I've just highlighted briefly here. One other piece about the external outcome is that the words effective and appropriate are both really important in terms of behavior and communication. That you might know of individuals who are very effective in what they do, but quite inappropriate in how they go about doing it. So for intercultural competence to occur, we need to have both effective and appropriate behavior and communication. Now, that's where assessment gets really, really complicated. Because when you ask, for example, if you ask me if I've been effective, I will say, yes, I've achieved my goals. And if you ask me if I've been appropriate, I will say, well, yeah, sure, I think I was appropriate. But I'm not the one to assess appropriateness. It's really only the other person, the other person I'm interacting with, who can say whether I've been appropriate or not. And that's why so many of the existing ways of measuring intercultural competence are only measuring half of the picture. They're only measuring the self-perspective. And if we're really serious about measuring and assessing intercultural competence, it needs to be from multiple perspectives. That the self-perspective alone, the 140 some different tools that already exist out there, that's only half of the picture. And so that's insufficient if we're really serious about measuring intercultural competence. The other part about measuring intercultural competence is found in this process orientation model that you see on the right side, that there are limits to any model or framework. And one of the limits to the pyramid model is that it almost implies there's a point at which we can become interculturally competent, but that wasn't actually matching the research. That in reality, intercultural competence development is a lifelong process. And so it's a lifelong process for each of us and for the persons we work with. So that process orientation becomes really important. And some of you might be familiar with Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, or Hammer's adaptation of that in terms of the continuum, which speaks much more about a developmental process. And looking at how that develops over time is really important. And so when we're assessing intercultural competence, it's important to understand that that's just a small snapshot in time, and that it's really this lifelong process. And so in the end, it might be that we focus more on the process part of it than we do on the results part, because the results are really for a lifetime. And we'll talk more about that at the end of our time together today. So this is the first research-based framework and models of intercultural competence. They've been used in program development, in curriculum development, and in assessment, where within this you can say, what are the priorities? What do you want to focus on? Is it maybe cultural self-awareness, or maybe it's in curiosity, or so on? So what is it? Or being able to see from different perspectives. And in fact, that is the only item that all of these experts agreed on 100% as being absolutely essential for intercultural competence development, is being able to see from others' perspectives. So within your context, within your program, what are the 2 or 3 key elements of intercultural competence that you really want to focus on and then assess? Because assessing all of this is really a huge undertaking. And as you can see, it's really much too complex then for one instrument to try to take on all of this. So there are many other definitions and frameworks. Chapter 1 of the SAGE Handbook of Intercultural Competence lists about 20 different frameworks. And I think also it's really important to consider that most of these existing frameworks come from the global north, and predominantly from Europe and the US. And so it's important for us to go beyond that to say, what are others' perspectives on intercultural competence, particularly outside of the global north? And so my research in recent years has focused on understanding more from Chinese perspectives, for example. And I've co-authored a chapter with some Chinese colleagues looking at Chinese perspectives on intercultural competence, had a Fulbright in South Africa where we were looking at South African perspectives on intercultural competence and so on. And we do see some different pieces emerging. And so it's important to then consider what's outside of the global north as well when we're looking at this. And so that really gets to the question of intercultural competence according to whom, which comes back to the assessment part as well. You're assessing this based on whose perspective. All right, so moving on, I wanted to show you a website where you could go to find these 2 models. And you'll also see some books where you can find more publications for this information that I've shared with you now, along with some additional information. So that on the NAFSA website, you'll find these 2 models, and it's a kind of nice summary there that you can print off and so on and use. And then you'll see some books, one of which just recently came out a few months ago on intercultural competence in higher education, but then also a more practical one on building cultural competence that goes into different models and activities and ways you can actually develop intercultural competence in your students, if you're interested in looking at more of the interactive ways to develop this. Okay. So we've talked about the why, making sure you're clear on why to assess, and then what to assess, what is intercultural competence, and being very clear on the definition and what you're basing that on. Now that we've covered those 2, we can get to the how. And again, I know that that's typically the starting point, but we need to resist that, talk about the why and the what first, and then we get to the how. And in terms of how, what is really important to ask is, what is the evidence of intercultural competence development? It's really focusing on evidence. What's the evidence of change that we will see? What would you say as changes in your students? How will you know that your students are developing intercultural competence, or how are they demonstrating curiosity? What's the evidence of that, or demonstrating respect, or so on? What is the evidence? That's the question you really need to focus on. And when we look at the evidence, we'll see 2 types of evidence that you can collect. The first is through direct evidence, and this is evidence of actual student learning during the experience itself. And these might be assignments, it can be reflections during the experience, if it's blog postings or so on. It can be observations by host families, teachers, or others. Peer feedback can be part of this direct methods, as well as tests, which is a more traditional way, and portfolios. And portfolios they're a place to archive this evidence, and it's important that we use the portfolios for reflection, so that then students can go back and look at their changes over time. So how can you build in direct evidence and how can you collect that direct evidence. This research is showing that this is really the most helpful type of evidence to collect to understand what is happening within the intercultural competence development experience of an individual. So focusing on direct evidence is really important. And notice that it does include different perspectives, not just from the student, but observations, for example, and from peers and so on. The other type of evidence is indirect evidence, and this would be perceptions of student learning, usually collected outside of the learning experience. So this is where we have the pre and post measures, focus groups, interviews. They're done either before and or after an experience. And those can also be valuable, but if we're only relying on that pre and post piece of it outside of the experience, we're missing a lot of what is happening in the development, in the process part of it. And what I've often seen happen is that programs that rely only on pre and post measures, for example, in one pre and post measure, they wonder, oh, what happens when maybe at the end, the post measure shows regression, shows a lower score. And if they've not collected any of the direct evidence during the experience, they don't have any explanation then for what happened. But what we're seeing is that depending on the measures used, that when direct evidence is collected, there's actually evidence, demonstrable evidence of growth and development of intercultural competence. And so that lower score at the end is students' awareness of, wow, I don't know as much about the world as I thought. I still have a long ways to go, that this is a lifelong process and so on. And so it's really important to have that combination of direct and indirect evidence in order to gain more that holistic picture of what is happening with the individuals, with the students we're working with. So that's just briefly about the evidence and really focusing on what is the evidence we need and how do we collect it. Those are some of the key questions to ask instead of what tool do I use, which is often the starting point. So let me pause just a moment and look at some of the questions that some of you have already posted to see. Okay, so back to the comment I was saying about what we're seeing about differences in definitions of intercultural competence. Yeah, let me comment briefly on that. As I mentioned, in the global north, a lot of the scholarly work has come to that from that area of the world. In the global north, so many of the definitions, even the one I just shared with you from my own work, is focused on the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of the individual. It's very individual focused, looking at knowledge, skills, and attitudes. It's a lot of the definitions that exist have some variation of that part of it, and very much the focus on the individual. When we look beyond the global north, let's say in South Africa, even one's identity as an individual is often looked at through the lens of Ubuntu. I am because we are. We are because I am. You cannot separate the individual from the group. And a recognition that what I do impacts you, what you do impacts me. And so that's a very different way of looking even at the individual. Also, in my work in South Africa, one of the pieces that emerged that I've not seen in any of the global north frameworks is this concept of courage. That courage is very much a part of intercultural competence. And in working further there on this, it was an understanding that even within one's culture, particularly if you think about South African society, there are so many different groups, so many differences, and it's easy to want to stay within one's own group. But it's important for intercultural competence to have the courage to go outside of one's group and to go toward those who are not like us. When I was working with colleagues in China, this concept of authenticity came out, that's a really important part, along with some other elements as well. But so some of that we don't see in the definitions from the global north. Okay. So those are some of the questions that have come across. I know there's, wow, several others as well, and hopefully we'll have time to answer some more of those at the end. So moving on, let me talk a little bit more about the how, because I think that might answer some of the questions that some of you have been posing as well. So some of the lessons learned from working with quite a few different groups on assessing intercultural competence, so not just AFS groups, but in higher ed and beyond, is that it's really important to make sure that your goals and your objectives are aligned, that they fit together. What does that mean? The goals need to be the destination. Where do you want your participants to be by the end of the program? And a goal could be to develop further intercultural competence. Goals are too broad to assess. So developing further intercultural competence, that's too broad to assess. That's where the objectives come in. So how will you move your students in that direction? How will you move them toward greater intercultural competence development? Those become the objectives. And objectives are very specific, and those are what are measurable. And those are what we assess. So, for example, if one of the objectives might be that students can articulate a global issue from 3 different perspectives, that would be an example of an objective that is aligned with the overall goal of developing intercultural competence. So then we would ask ourselves, what is the evidence that students can articulate a global issue from at least 3 different perspectives? And then we collect that evidence. And as you can see in that particular example, that's not necessarily collected through a self-report inventory, that they actually would need to, you would need to collect evidence of that they can articulate from 3 different perspectives. So the objectives move us in that direction, and they're very specific and measurable, and that's what we would assess. So that's the second point, is collecting the evidence that the students have achieved those objectives. And then it's important then, as we've talked about before, based on definitions of intercultural competence, that we use a multiple method approach to try to collect some of this evidence. And so those are some of the important lessons learned. And for example, what we're seeing emerging with multiple method is through peer feedback and peer input on this as well. So that's increasingly looking like it's becoming important. So those are some of the lessons learned, and those of you who are more experienced, I'm sure you've had some lessons learned as well. Let me give you some examples. One of you had a question about what are some examples, what have we seen outside of the AFS world? Well, here are some university examples. This is coming from the book that my Australian colleague, Lily Aris-Ratnam-Smith, and I put together, called Intercultural Competence in Higher Education. It's a book of 29 case studies. So what you see here on the screen is just highlights from 4 of those case studies. But these are case studies from around the world that we were asking. In the case studies, you'll see how they're defining intercultural competence, what they're doing to develop the intercultural competence, and then how are they assessing it. And it's not, there are only a few study abroad programs among the case studies. Some of these include curriculum in the classroom, and then some of it includes what happens outside the classroom. So both informal and formal learning, and only a few of them really focused on the exchange or study abroad too. So what we're seeing in the US at Virginia Commonwealth University, that they're using a variety, as you can see here, all of them are using a variety of assessments, so not just one. But they use self-assessment, which can be an important part, but they also use collaborative papers, group workshops, reflections, and peer assessment to assess their elements of intercultural competence. At Tokyo Metropolitan University in Japan, you'll see that they use a journal, student journal. They also use simulation, which means that they are observing the students in the simulation. And then they use presentations and self and team evaluations. And the team evaluation, of course, includes that peer feedback as well, peer assessment. In Spain, at Doistro University, you'll see that there's peer and facilitator feedback used, as well as oral presentations and a portfolio where they're collecting evidence throughout the learning experience. And in The Hague University, the Netherlands, they use a combination of exams, presentations, essays, a portfolio also, and reflections. So those are just some examples of how programs in higher education are using multiple methods and multiple perspectives in assessing the various elements of intercultural competence. I want to kind of leave you now with 5 strategies that, first of all, to adapt what you're already doing. This is not something you have to drastically change or bring in something totally new, but adapt and look at what evidence is already being collected. Again, making sure you have clearly defined goals and objectives and definitions of intercultural competence, but after that, and you know why you're assessing, look at how can you adapt what you're already doing to collect the evidence that's needed. And some of that might be through intake forms. There can be a number of other ways that you're already collecting evidence that you can utilize to see if the students are achieving the stated objectives or not. Second, to focus on formative assessment. So this is the assessment collected during the learning experience. CATs that you see listed there are classroom assessment techniques, and those can be just really quick assessments that are done in the learning experience itself. Obviously doesn't have to occur in a classroom. One of the techniques that can be used in formal and informal learning is simply to ask students, I used to think, now I think. Or I used to be able to do, but now I can, I used to only see from my perspective. Now I can see more things from the host perspective. So something as simple as I used to think, now I think can be included as part of a formative assessment. And there are others like that as well. Certainly incorporating multiple perspectives is a very good strategy to use. And as I mentioned, we're seeing an increased use of peer assessment around the world. So that's something you might want to consider or perhaps are already using. Involving the learner is becoming really, really crucial, particularly with the emphasis on co-creating and so on. And one way to involve the learner is through learning contracts. Remember, we talked about how intercultural competence development is a lifelong process, that there's no one size fits all on assessment or on development. And it's important to recognize that those we're working with are at different places in their own journey. And a learning contract allows the participants to be able to say where they are and what the next steps that they want to achieve, and which can be different for each learner. And that learning contract is negotiated then with those who are working with the program. There's a whole body of literature around learning contracts. This was developed back in the 1970s. Someone who's written largely about it, his name is Malcolm Knowles, Knowles. And so I encourage you to read more about learning contracts. These have been used with participants at all ages, including even very young ages, where they use pictures as opposed to words to say what they want to learn. So there's a lot of uses for this, and increasingly we're seeing the learning contracts being used as well. And I believe some of the programs are already using those. And finally, consider the learning over time. And I already mentioned about the portfolios as a place to collect the evidence of changes in students over time. But it's not enough to just have an archival place to put this kind of evidence. What's most important and valuable is to have guided reflection for the students, to be able to reflect on their changes over time and on how intercultural competence has hopefully developed and enhanced over time. And so we're seeing, as you saw from the examples here, some examples of the use of e-portfolios as well. All right, so those are 5 strategies. Some of you might already be using them, and others might want to consider 1 or 2 here to start and to begin to use. So with that, I wanted to just end with kind of what we see as a changing paradigm around intercultural competence assessment. That in the past and up to this point, it has been more program or course centered, very traditional evidence, meaning that pre and post measure, for example, and with tests and so on. It's been more passive, as in assessment is something being done to the students. It's been very much oriented to a self perspective. It's been a more of a standardized, let's just do the same thing for everyone. It's usually seen as separate. Okay, so now we're going to assess intercultural competence, and it's done very separate from anything else, any other kinds of assessments. And it's been very results focused, that we really want to see whether someone is or is not developing intercultural competence. What we're seeing emerging is this changing paradigm where it's much more learner-centered. The learner is really at the center. We're looking at the authentic evidence, and we've already talked about some of those types of evidence of what can be collected in the experience itself. That students are very much an active part of this assessment, for example, through the learning contract, that they're saying, here's what I want to learn, here's how I'm going to learn it, here's the evidence that I've learned it. It's much more of the multiple perspective focus, including, as I mentioned, the peer and other observers. It's tailored very much to the learners, recognizing that they are indeed in different places, that they're not all at the same place on this intercultural journey. Increasingly, it's much more holistic, to see how is it connected to emotional intelligence, to moral leadership, and so on. So it's much more holistic in its approach, as opposed to separating intercultural competence out. And certainly some of the processes like e-portfolio assessment and so on lend itself quite well to that. And that there's much more of a focus on the process itself, in the recognition that this is indeed a lifelong process. And so it's not so results oriented. So that's what we're seeing as a changing paradigm. And I wrote about this in the last chapter of a book. For those of you who are relatively new to assessment and intercultural assessment, you might find helpful the book on Demystifying Outcomes Assessment for International Educators, a Practical Approach. This came out just a couple years ago from Stylus, and I really tried to put a lot of information I've shared with you here in that book as a way of trying to make it much more practical and accessible, because I know that assessment in general can be quite overwhelming and daunting, particularly from the outset in starting out. So that might be a helpful resource to you. Other opportunities I wanted to mention to you, for those of you who are engaged in researching intercultural competence, a few years ago I started an online network called ICC Global, and I invite you to join. It's really more for researchers. So if that's of interest to you, please go to iccglobal.org and complete a profile and sign up. It takes a few days for that to go through. And then be sure to post an introduction to yourself so that we can see you there, and questions that you might have about researching or assessing intercultural competence. I would say the assessment forum has been the more active one on that site. And we're hoping to make it more robust as we continue with this network. One other opportunity for you is that I've been involved with, over the past year, with UNESCO in developing a tool called story circles that can be used in a wide variety of contexts and settings for developing intercultural competence. And we have piloted this story circles project in Thailand in July, and we piloted it just last month in Zimbabwe, before the change in leadership that occurred just this week. And we are hoping to pilot it in Costa Rica in the early part of 2018. And we certainly invite you, if you're interested, to pilot this as well. But we have been astonished at the results of the Story Circles project in terms of developing some of these various aspects of intercultural competence, including the listening for understanding, development of empathy, development of cultural self-awareness, and particularly then with respect and curiosity. So it really hits on a number of the different elements that I have mentioned to you already. And if you have questions about anything I've shared with you today, or if you're interested in particularly the UNESCO Story Circles project, it's not online yet. Be watching for it. We've written a manual that will hopefully be online in the early part of 2018. But if you have questions about that, I'd be happy to respond to you by email. You see my email listed there, d.deerdorf@duke.edu. With that, I realize we only have about 10 minutes left for questions. And I know a number of you do have questions. So let's see if we can get to a few of those. Question about, can I explain the portfolio a bit more? Yes, so portfolio, there are a number of companies that have actually developed their own platforms for this. So it's not something you have to develop from from scratch, as we say in English. But there are a number of different platforms, and I know AFS is using the portfolio system as well, where students can upload maybe their reflections, they can upload assignments, they can, if an observer has observed them in an interaction and written about it, they can upload an observer's write up about that and so on. So it's not just from the student. And then this can be not just for one program, but I know at my university, it's actually across the students' 4 years at the university. So it's beyond one course or program. And then there can be guided reflection on looking at how students have changed from maybe the very first work that they uploaded to perhaps their final project that they might have uploaded, or a final reflection, and looking at what are the changes that they can see have occurred from the beginning toward the end. For example, in terms of their identity. In some of the courses I teach, I have students write about their identity in the beginning, and then maybe in the middle of the course, and then at the end. And if those have been uploaded to the portfolio, they can look and see for themselves how they've changed in terms of describing their own identity based on what we're doing in the course. So there's a lot more about e-portfolios available in the literature. There's even a whole conference dedicated to just e-portfolios if you're interested in attending a conference on that. So there are a lot of different resources. A question about, could I share the name of the author again of the learning contract methodologies? Yeah, that was Malcolm Knowles, Knowles, Malcolm Knowles. And he published quite a bit. It would have been from the 70s and 80s, but it's kind of considered classic work now on learning contracts. And you can find a lot of different examples online on the internet as well. But strongly encourage you to take a look at that, because it's a way to make this learning relevant to the students, to the participants, so they can say what exactly they want to do, how they will do it, what is the evidence that they have achieved it. And it's negotiated with you, with someone else. And that's an important piece of it as well. So guided reflection would involve questions that you would give to the students. Then they could go back and either look at their own writing or look at what they put into the portfolio. So you could ask questions like, how has your identity changed over time? Provide examples from the work that you have in your portfolio. And so they have to reflect on that. Let's see. Question about free or low cost cultural competence inventories. That's a tricky one to answer, because there are ones you'll find out there, but I would caution you, whether they're free or low cost or expensive, be very careful about using actual cultural competence inventories. It's really important that whatever inventory you use, first of all, be reliable and valid. And oftentimes free ones may not be, meaning that they actually measure what they say they measure, and that they are consistent over time with in other contexts and other groups of people. That's the reliable and valid part. And also, it's really important that you're very clear on your goals and objectives first. And then if you're going to use an inventory, to find one that actually aligns as closely as possible with your stated objectives. Otherwise, even if you find an inventory that is very reliable and valid, and you see, oh, look, a lot of other people are using this one. Okay, true, but if it's not aligned as closely as possible with your specific objectives, the results will be invalid. And that's really important to recognize and understand, that even though other people are using a particular inventory, even though it's shown to be reliable and valid, if it's not aligned with what you're trying to do, the results will be invalid. So I can't stress enough the alignment, matching, making sure it fits as closely as possible. So for example, if you're talking about different perspectives, and that's part of your objectives, then finding an inventory on attitudes, it's not a fit. Even though it's all part of intercultural competence, the one is measuring attitudes, but your objective talks about different perspectives. And that's something very different in intercultural competence than the attitudes. And so it's really important that that fit, that match be there. And otherwise your results will be invalid. So just a caution in general about using the 140 some inventories that might be out there. All right, so I believe that brings us up to close to the top of the hour. And I want to turn it back to Sarah. And I apologize, I know there were several other questions that you have asked and that we did not have a chance to answer. If you're welcome to contact me, and I'm happy to try to respond at that point as well. I want to thank you again so much for your interest in this topic. In the end, it's really not about assessment per se. In my opinion, it's really more about how can we help facilitate better relationships in terms of learning to live together and what is necessary for doing that. And so I want to thank each of you for all the work you're doing in this area. And thanks to AFS for sponsoring this webinar. And back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Darla. You gave us a lot to think about, and we really appreciate it. So as Darla said, we will be following up, and you have her email, so feel free to ask her some questions directly, but we will be sending the recording of this this webinar on Monday, as well as a survey, and we will try to include some of these references that she was talking about as well, such as, I know there was a question about the TED Talk you mentioned and some other things, so we can try to include that. Before we conclude here, I just want to say thanks again, Darla, and for all of you located around the world, there probably is an AFS office where you are located, and we would love for us to be in touch. So if you're interested in learning more about AFS, or if you'd love to get more resources, or even intercultural trainings, please contact your AFS office or contact us, and we can put you in touch with those offices around the world. And we have next year our AFS Global Conference, which is taking place in Budapest, Hungary. So we would like you to save the date, and you could even pre-register at the link here at afs.org/conference. This is September 26th until the 28th next year in Budapest, so we hope to see you there. So again, Darla, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this very important issue. It's always nice to be reminded that intercultural competence development is a lifelong process, and it's so holistic. So it's really great to have that in mind. And we appreciate your time, and we thank you all for joining, and we hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we hope to see you at other AFS webinars. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Darla Dierdorf, and we will all see you later.